Everybody, welcome. If you are just joining us, my name is Matt. I run DV Talent, of which Talent Manager is part. If you can just, for now, switch off, make sure your Zoom is muted, and also, I think if you can switch off your video as well, that would be, I think, better, probably slightly less distracting for people. As I said, I'm just gonna talk for a minute. Welcome to, this is our latest of our Talent Manager Masterclass. I think certainly the most topical of them, given the election and everything that goes on with Trump. It's probably the only one for which I'm hoping there isn't a sequel. I hope Rob and Kate don't take that the wrong way, because it's a brilliantly enjoyable watch. I'm sure everyone who's seen it will agree. And if you haven't, you've got to catch up on it and watch the last episode tonight. So as I said, we've got Rob Coldstream, who's the exec producer, and Kate Quinn, who's the producer, both from 72 Films. Just before I hand over to Robin Parker, who's going to be running the masterclass and asking the questions, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, apologies. I think on some of the advertising, it was saying this session is going to run till 7:30, but actually it's going to be till a bit before 7. We're going to wrap up. We're not doing one of the networking sessions afterwards, so it's just going to be the masterclass, and then we're going to finish. If you have questions, as I said, Robin will do the interview, and then we'll hand over and do a Q&A. If you can put your questions in the chat, which you should find at the bottom of your screen if you're not familiar with Zoom, and then we will try and come round to you as best we can. Just say, those of you late joining us, if you can keep your Zoom on mute and your videos off for now. And just lastly to say that please do look out for some of the other masterclasses we've got coming up. We're sponsors of the Grierson, so we're going to be running some ahead of the Grierson Awards with some of the filmmakers who are shortlisted for that, which is always really fascinating to hear their making of their programs. And if you haven't registered for it yet either, if you are interested in documentaries, the Grierson Awards this year, you're very lucky you can actually watch it live because it's all being done on Zoom. So if you register now, you can actually watch the Griersons, which is a great event, probably my favourite of all the award ceremonies each year. Anyway, I'm just going to hand over to Robin Parker now.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so we're here to look at The Trump Show. As Matt says, it's on BBC Two, finishing tonight, a 3-part series, looking at the noise, the spectacle, the theatre, the unreality of the administration.
Well, yeah, as you said, it's a nice way in.
Sorry, someone's not on mute there. Could you just mute yourself? I'll do some muting. Sorry about that. Sorry, I was saying it's been a 3-part series, and it's coming to an end tonight and bring us bang up to date with where we are ahead of the US elections next week. So here to discuss it, we have Rob Coldstream, the executive producer for 72 Films. Rob is a former Channel 4 commissioner in Specialist Factual, who also worked on Channel 4's series about Jade Goody, the reality star who changed Britain. Channel 4's The Queen in 3D, The Execution of Gary Glitter, The Rise and Fall of Tony Blair, The Last Days of Anne Boleyn, and The Prince of Pleasure. So all human life is there in his work, I think. And Kate Quinn, who's the producer, has been 72 Films since 2017. Series producer on series including The House of Assad and The Rise of the Nazis. And she's also previously worked on How to Find Love Online and Britain on the Sick, amongst other documentaries. As I say, it's a 72 film series. You may know some of the other productions that have gone recently, including All or Nothing for Amazon about Tottenham Hotspur, and the Murdoch Dynasty, the Rise of the Murdoch Dynasty, which aired in the same slot, I think, or a similar slot on BBC Two not too long ago. I think we could probably start, if Matt could line up a clip of the show, just to remind ourselves of Mr. Trump and how this series went about showing what he's done. Okay, here we go.
The president called and asked, did I come over to the Oval Office to catch up? And the president came in and said, hey, I know you need help. You're getting killed out there. And he says, I'm bringing in Anthony Scaramucci.
Stick pink shit, stink pink gators. My Detroit players, Tim's for my hooligans in Brooklyn.
This was not going to be a good fit for a lot of reasons.
Papa been smooth since days of under rules. Never lose, never choose to. Bruce Cruz who?
Take a look at the camera. How do I look? Well, I'm going to look like an ostentatious nouveau riche prick, okay? But I'm going to do it for you, okay? I think he has a lot of confidence in me understanding his message and being able to explain his message. So the good news there is he didn't have any talking points or anything like that. He says, okay, go and do a good job. That's what he always says, actually, you know, go do a good job.
Okay, and as that clip suggests, there is some playfulness, shall we say, in the way that this tackles its subject. Can you guys take me back to the pitch and to why you wanted to revisit Trump? Clearly, it's, you know, up to the election, I'm sure was part of the plan. But I know you guys have worked previously on a series on Trump was it for Channel 4, I think, the first series you did?
Yeah, so the sort of the history to that was that I'd commissioned a show from '72 about the rise of Trump when I was working at Channel 4 as a bit of a Trump obsessive, myself and David Glover at '72. And that was very much a sort of conceived as a kind of a box set, sort of slightly would be sort of archive feature docky sort of series that sort of charted his kind of rise to power across 4 decades of American history. And I think the thing with this show was kind of a sequel, but conceived in quite a different way, I think, in the sense that, you know, we were talking about it at 72 and, you know, and it's out there for everyone to see, right? The Trump presidency, you know, it felt to us like, and we're not the first people to sort of say this, like, partly by design of Trump himself and partly by accident, a kind of wild reality show in its own right. And I suppose the original pitch was, what if we condense this incredible 4 years, the most jaw-dropping 4 years in American political history, where every week there's another incredible, you know, scandal. What if you condense that into a series, but sort of conceive of it almost as a reality show in its own right, as it were. So it's about this sort of charismatic kind of ringmaster, showmaster, kind of snake oil salesman huckster, who's kind of orchestrating a kind of, as I say, partly accidentally and partly deliberately, a sort of chaotic spectacle. And it's sort of collision between the sort of almost surreal comedy of that, if you will, with the fact that it's actually incredibly important. And this is, you know, perhaps the most powerful guy in the world with his finger on the nuclear button. That's incredibly sort of pokey kind of proposition. So that was the idea, really. It was Trump the reality show was the pitch. And as it happened, Norma Percy, I believe, had already been commissioned at that point when we went to the BBC to do her own show, which I think is coming out next year, which, as I understand it, is more of a classical, what you might expect from Norma, you know, really thorough political analysis of, I think it's about Trump foreign policy, I believe. So the BBC were quite keen for us to sort of push it out there and get it, you know, in really sort of different territory as well. So it was just a good sort of combination of what they wanted and what we were offering, I guess.
And I imagine you're pitching at a time when everyone's got their take on Trump and on American politics. What was the feedback from the channel about what made this stand out? Was it that kind of slightly, I suppose, tongue-in-cheek or slightly left field way of looking at his presidency, almost looking at it through his own eyes to some extent? You know, how does this guy's brain work? How does he treat this presidency?
Yeah, I think there's a sort of, I think, you know, as soon as we talked about it, there was this kind of fascination. You know, I think as Rob said, excuse me, on one hand, there was this sort of idea of this mad experiment, a bit like those kind of 80s films, those sort of trading places. What happens if you take the most unlikely person and put him in the most powerful job in the world? What does that do to him as a character, and what does that do to the people around him, and the, you know, politics and democracy around him? So the sort of question we kept coming back to is, what's going on? What is it like to be him? What's going on in his head? And and the sort of question, $1 million question about Trump is, does he have a hinterland? Is there one? He puts so much out there. He tweets every single thought he's ever had. What's how do you kind of pare that back, peel back the layers when so much of that is on show? And there's this sort of endless kind of fascination with, what is the psychology? How do you get to the heart of someone's psychology when they seem to be telling you absolutely everything about themselves? Is it that there's nothing, he has no hinterland, or is it that actually there is something else to be revealed here? And I think we probably still don't have the answer to that, but I think the answer is probably a bit of both.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think working out what was in his head, as Kate says, is a fascinating thing, and you peel the layers back. And the horrific thing is, as you peel the layers back, or you try to, the worry is that there's actually nothing inside, and I don't think that is quite true. There is a really fascinating person in there, but it is very hard to get into his head. But part of the proposition was, we really, really want to understand this guy. We don't want to just tell you what you already know about him, that he's a lying, narcissistic, sociopathic, bully, because he's also other things as well. And so we wanted to sort of make him a three-dimensional character, but with some comedy, because you need comedy to sort of stick with 3 hours of this, I think. And you mentioned the 80s movies, Kate. There was one sort of movie that we were quite influenced by, which is a 1990s movie with Kevin Kline called Dave, which Dave is an impersonator, he's a lookalike, and he happens to look like the US president. And he's brought in to sort of double for the president at an event, because the president's had a heart attack whilst having sex with one of his aides. And he ends up liking the job so much, and the president never recovers, that he sort of becomes president, and he becomes incredibly popular. And so the idea of the kind of the fish out of water seemed really, our series almost is like the movie Dave. Here's this guy who suddenly becomes president, and he's completely unsuited to it and not really interested in doing it in any sort of normal sense of the word. So that sort of gave us quite a good proposition beyond just the tonal thing of it being, let's make it fun, wild, and reality TV. There's also quite an interesting, if you like, sort of thesis there, which is what happens when you put someone like that under pressure. What do you find out about them, and what does it reveal about the sort of durability of American democracy? That slightly sounds a bit pompous, but I guess that's the underlying things that we were sort of interested in.
And what new light did it shed for you? And one thing I was quite intrigued by watching it is raising that question of how much he expected to win, because he's such a, because he has such a bravado and a front to him that that everything's great and of course I was going to win and stuff. But you could capture some moments in the in the announcements in the countdown 4 years ago, where the moment's kind of sinking in. Were you kind of aware of that side of things before? Did that sort of come up within the kind of archive research and things? Because I didn't. While he had a lot of people,
and I've had the pleasure and the privilege and the joy of doing these sorts of shows, is we've sat around reading. There's so many books, hundreds and dozens. I mean, so obviously we now we know quite a lot, but I didn't, so it's just through getting paid to read books about Trump, really. I mean,
and sift through that archive and find those moments where and I think that's, you pointed out those moments where you catch him slightly off guard, and we're constantly, for a man who spends every moment, coordinating the lighting and the camera angles of every press conference. It's quite tricky to find those moments where you catch him off, where you kind of go, am I seeing the mask slipped a bit there? And it's those moments where capturing that, as you say, in those pictures, tallies with what we were reading in books, what we were hearing from people we were talking to and interviewing. But no, I think it was, from everything we've read and everything everyone's told us, it was a bit of a, I'm the winner and I like winning. It was a bit of a business gamble, really. I think he thought this is a good way to promote the endlessly failing and yet surviving brand. And then it sort of became a reality that he didn't want to let go of. But I think I genuinely don't think he had thought about what would happen beyond the point of being the winner. And I think, so when you see in those photographs that look, and it sort of tallies with everything that we've been seeing, those are one of those sort of those rare moments where you go, that's a real revelatory moment for us in the storytelling, because that's the moment where you want to get a glimpse of who the real man is.
I've got everything I want. What do I do with it?
Yeah.
And in terms of approaching access on docs like this, and I guess this goes for the Murdochs and other series as well. You do aim high, and you do get some great people. And one advantage I guess you had here is he's fired so many people, and now they can talk. So there's the firing of them is a narrative in its own way, but so is there's a volume of contributors. How do you sort of draw up your hit list and get the right mix of people that kind of tell the story, from all angles, really, I suppose, and persuade them to take part? I mean, if they're no longer part of it and they've voiced criticisms, I can see it's another outlet for them. But there must be others who are perhaps a little less.
Well, Kate here is absolutely masterful at this, and Kate and Louis Lee Ray, our assistant producer as well, was incredibly good. But Kate, you can speak to this, can't you?
Well, I think I definitely want to underline the massive reference to Louis Lee Ray, who was incredible and sort of tireless. I suppose even without a pandemic, it's a tough order. These people are sort of characters, all very strong characters in their own right, who have their own agendas, who have their own sort of bargaining price in terms of what they're willing to, who they think they're going to speak to and whether they're going to trust you. So we spent quite a lot of time. This is the first thing we did at the very beginning. We sort of spent a really long time, longer than I probably ordinarily would, working out exactly how to pitch ourselves to them, in a sort of with keeping our American audience in mind, almost sort of trumping ourselves up in our sort of opening gambit, our opening pitch to them, to sort of make sure that our sales pitch would sort of land and be a sales pitch rather than your sort of usual I'm writing to you from the BBC sort of approach. So we had quite a sort of put a lot of time and thought into our sort of opening approach. How we decided who to interview was interesting. Obviously, we wanted the characters who make up the Trump show, Trump's world, but we wanted to make sure, that people could give us a real insight. There were some people we'd interview who felt like really big gets because they were, right there and then, but would ultimately turn out to be too nervous to say anything. And everybody's thinking about, settling their own scores. So I suppose, sorry, just go back. So one. But
the Trump fear factor was one interesting thing. Is all your references. Exactly. A lot of some of the interviewees they're still, even though they may have been fired, Trump still holds their career in his hands in a sense. He can make or break someone quite easily if you're in the Washington world. So we got some really quite senior figures who actually didn't make the final cut because they were too scared to say anything. So carry on, Kate.
But I suppose thinking about what are they going to contribute, which is a combination of they're bringing the sense of Trump world to the screen. They're all characters in their own right. Scaramucci, who we saw in the clip, is such a sort of just by dint of spending some time in his presence, you get a picture of this is what the White House was like. The endless, painful, year-long negotiation with Bannon to finally get him on screen, which included an episode where he literally texted me and said, "Kate, I'm off to sea," and I thought he was joking, but actually he really had gone off to sea to evade a arrest for a while.
But Kate, to finish the Bannon story, it's actually fascinating. It is quite a good one because we were chasing Bannon. Basically, day one, we emailed Bannon and said, "Will you do an interview?" He fires back immediately. Talk to my assistant. So we're going, "Yay, great, got Bannon day one. This is going to be easy." 9 months later, he still hasn't given us a date. I've actually gone and doorstepped him in Washington, still can't get through to him. He then sends Kate this email saying, gone sailing with some Chinese billionaire plotting some anti-China propaganda thing. And then
he
finally...
he was joking. So I texted and said, "We'll send a boat." And he said, "No, I really am on a ship." And we looked it up. And it turned out it was because he was about to be arrested. He finally got back to Washington and was on dry land again, so we picked up the chase again.
But tell us, but he actually was arrested. At which point for fraud, possibly be the 7th person Trump's campaign team to go to prison. But when he got arrested, we thought, well, that's it. We're really not going to get him now. And then we realised, actually, he's kind of on a house arrest. Got him, and we've put one more bid in, and you got him.
We finally got there. I've got a very strange series of messages on my phone, but he was arraigned the day of our interview. So even on the morning of our interview, there was a lot of change, and suddenly he was about to pull out, and then finally he could do it. We had to get the crew to be at his place, and he bounded in very, very cheerful, because he'd actually literally walked out of a Zoom court hearing and into our interview, but had discovered that really the case was going to be kicked into the long grass, and so he was in a very good mood. So we actually got a good interview from him eventually. But yeah, so there was an endless sort of circus of chasing people who, and I suppose, back to the point, what I was originally saying was just getting those people in front of you, and the process of getting to them built up this incredible picture of what it must have been like, particularly in that first year in the White House. So when we were choosing who to speak to, it was those moments. You get someone like him sitting down, you get someone like Omarosa sitting down. Even just those, that opening sequence of episode 1 tells you a lot about what you need to know about Trump's White House and who he is by the people he chose to have around him.
I mean, being British and sort of, it's you obviously have to play each bid individually, but being British and being BBC did help in some cases, because the politics is so polarized in the US that they sort of had some faith that we would not be, sort of grossly biased, and they quite like that. Whereas in a lot of other cases, being the BBC was a disadvantage, because we're just a small, distant, foreign, quite irrelevant broadcaster, really, in terms of mainstream American politics. And a lot of people, they really, if they didn't think they were going to get some electoral advantage or some political advantage, they weren't interested. And also a lot of the characters, the production companies in pretty much every country in the world are sort of bombarding these characters with bids. So it was quite hard to make yours stand out.
So do you play up the slight irreverence or left field nature of the program, particularly if they've got Norma Percy's people contacting them to do the authoritative one? And supplementary to that, might as well load the things together. Were they aware, and did they all kind of buy into the style, the motif you had of them preparing for the interview and the first time you see them as a little sort of character introduction?
Yeah, I mean, I think we always made sure, or Kate made sure, that I told them, we are rolling now. Is that okay? And in most cases, they were very happy with it. They're very sort of camera savvy, most of these people. And in the case of Scaramucci, I mean, he really didn't,
Yeah.
he plays up to it. A lot of them do, same with Rudy Giuliani. And I think the reason why they're in Trump world is because all of them are slightly monstrous figures in their own right, who crave attention in some sense. So,
and their performance, they're not. This is a reality show. They know this is the Trump show. They know where the camera is. There's a strong sense. We, from a sort of compliance perspective, we're always very conscious that they must, they have to know that the camera is rolling. But from a sort of personality perspective, I think that was that's kind of part of the deal with them. I think with a lot of people interviewed.
And at the point in which you were filming, I don't know the mood around Trump at that particular time. And was it particularly difficult to find the defenders? Was that a time when perhaps there was more, political support for him in Washington?
Hard to find Trump supporters.
Yeah. I mean, if you make in the last couple of months, I think clearly there's a bit of a mood in America. Things are a bit different. In terms of getting some appropriate balance, I guess, of different sides, rather than just preaching to the converted with, here's why Trump's a maniac or whatever. Finding people like not just Bannon, but other people who are perhaps more measured about their take on him. Was that?
Well, so the interesting sort of conundrum, almost by definition, is we were reliant on people who Trump has fired, because serving members of the administration won't give us an interview. So and it's odd, isn't it? Because we didn't really interview a single Democrat in the series. They're all Republicans, and all of them are people like, you know, John Bolton and so on, they're extreme right wingers, most of them. But Trump is sort of, he's so off the charts that, you know, when you're talking about balance, it's quite an interesting conundrum, really. Because when you have someone who's so sort of hard to position on the spectrum, how can you be balanced with someone that sort of extreme? So
what did compliance have to say about that?
But but what you see in the series is when you have people, Trump sort of people who are speaking for him or supporting him, like Rudy Giuliani or Pastor Mark Burns or, you know, or Bannon, you let them talk. And I mean, it's weird. Sometimes the more you let his supporters talk, the worse he looks, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
One thing I think was really interesting, so we were talking, because obviously it was really crucial for this to for the programme to sort of be appropriate tonally, but also because we're making it for BBC. Really important that we felt that there was a real balance to it. And as Rob says, you know, everyone in it by default has probably been fired or similar by Trump. So, but one thing that really emerged in the process and the edit was that when you write down, when you looked at the script, at what people were saying, it could often feel quite critical. If you're looking for something, gosh, there's quite a lot of anti-Trump sentiment. When you watch it, there's a huge amount of airtime that really does that gives Trump a huge amount of credit, showing what he does best, which is, you know, there's moments when he's at a rally where you can have 10 people say, you know, he lied, he he misled us deliberately, he made this decision, he, you know, turned back, you know, he's made morally inappropriate decisions, etc. You have all millions of people say that, and then you just show a clip of Trump standing on stage at a rally performing, and you go, oh, okay, yeah, that's why he's so brilliant. That's brilliant. That's what's so brilliant. But it's really interesting in a program like this that doesn't translate on the page in the written script, but
that's because if you ask a supporter to give us sort of an intellectual rationalization in terms of policy agenda and achievement and so on, it's very hard to do, because when you drill down into it, there really isn't that much there. The skill and the brilliance and the dark genius is in as Bannon, you know, would say, it's the signal, not the noise, as he would say. It's this message he's sending almost subliminally to his supporters, and his brilliance at communicating that it is kind of political genius. And from a program making point of view, that's kind of a gift, because it's all there on his face. And one of the nice things with this show was being able to run at length scenes where one could live in the archive and see him at a press conference or a rally. And rather, when you see it on the news, you get 3 minutes or 3 seconds or 10 seconds. But when you see it at length, you can start to see his sort of, it's both the brilliance of it, but I don't know, it's sort of just the madness of it, I guess.
And in terms of the time frame in which you're filming, can you tell us a bit about that? Because the narrative that you might have sketched out, clearly, you know, coronavirus, lockdown, there's huge disruptions there. What was the impact there? Because I believe you were filming in the States. Was that sort of up to the wire as lockdown hit over here?
Well, it was quite tragic, because Kate and I had planned this incredible road trip. You know, we were going to drink Jack Daniels with Stormy Daniels in Houston and cruise through Brooklyn with Scaramucci, and it never came to pass. We had a lot of interviews set up, and we were just about to go to do our first trip, and then the pandemic hit, and Trump issued the European travel ban. At which point, it was pretty clear that there would be a UK ban. So there was a sort of couple of days where we had a mad scramble to get into the US in case, you know, it was too late. So I managed to get in and do a couple of interviews, but then things escalated to the point where I had to come home. At which point we had to sort of make this decision: what are we going to do? This is impossible. We've lost everyone. A lot of people are sheltering. No one can travel on the ground in the US. Do we pull the plug? But we sort of decided to just battle on from sort of pretty much week by week, just seeing if we could. When I was in the States, I sort of established a really good relationship with a fantastic producer there called Pip Gilmore and a great DOP, Stefan Wiesen. And we just developed a system, which I guess lots of other people are using, where they would go to a location, COVID proofed and cleaned, etc. They would set up the interview, and we would simply ask the questions over, an iPad, almost as if we were in the room. And gradually, that just seemed to become, the normal way of working, and so we got momentum back, and we managed to, thanks to Kate and Louis, got most of our interviewees back. And in a way, weirdly, we sort of, although it's never the same not being in the actual room as the interviewee, obviously, because you miss the sort of interpersonal cues and so on. But in other ways, it sort of helped us a bit, because rather than having to do the traditional thing of let's go to America, we've got 5 days to get all our shooting done, we could just pick off the interviews one by one as and when they became available. So we sort of, in some senses, covered more ground, I think.
Including, when Omarosa was in Florida, and we would have ordinarily done most of our filming in DC. So our crew, quite early on during lockdown, got hired an RV and did a road trip for us. I love this as there's a sort of behind the scenes movie in there somewhere. This sort of RV making its way across the States for us, which I thought was quite above and beyond Call of Duty. But
so did you lose some interviewees as a result of this, or did you manage to, was your hit list pretty well?
I mean, we certainly lost a lot, and it was a constant rolling battle. So we'd have people booked in who were, had agreed to do it in a sort of ordinary filming schedule. It was a yes, they were booked in, and then we lost them. And then we sort of would get them back again, and then we'd lose them again. And there were people who couldn't do it because they had family and stuff, like they were isolating, or who had symptoms and pulled out. We had people who whose employers wouldn't let them do it in the setup, even though we obviously had very strict rules and would only do Zoom interviews. So we lost quite a few people on that basis.
Who's your greatest? Who's your greatest? Could have been.
I actually think it's funny. There's hundreds. There's always, and as I'm sure everyone has this. There's hundreds of people who at the time feel like the absolute biggest losses, and they're fine. I feel like it's the mayor of DC. It's the episode 3 people who, because episode 3 was sort of the bits of floor, the path was kind of making itself in front of us as we were going. It was happening in real time as we were making it. So it was a lot harder to capture people to get people on the ground. And there were 2 or 3 people, I think, certainly Mayor of DC was one, who had agreed to do it, and it was, I think was one I feel like. We
had a couple. I mean, at the point when COVID hit, I mean, we had a couple that were sort of not completely booked, but were kind of the hook was in the mouth, and we had Arnold Schwarzenegger, and we were talking to Robert De Niro, who's clashed with Trump. And those are my. But weirdly,
Cohen, we were so close to Cohen. Michael Cohen. I think if we'd had one more week, we'd have got Michael Cohen. And but of course, it was Roger Stone. Roger Stone's the one that got away.
Yeah.
Because we got close.
But he went to prison. Just a couple of days before he went to prison. We were chasing him for a long time, and we got an incredibly rude email back from him, the first bid, saying, "You must be fucking joking, the BBC, you're dishonest, so I sort of did a high risk sort of email back saying, I can't remember what, but basically begging for an interview and saying, this is like no other BBC show you've ever seen. And then I got a text about 3 a.m. from Roger Stone eventually, and he just said, "I'm ready to talk." And I was like, yes, great. But we just didn't have time to get a crew to him before he got sent to prison. So it was quite a mad experience all in all.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about some of the sort of editorial choices? I'm thinking specifically of how you go about making politics entertaining. Now, clearly, Trump is a different beast to many, but both this and the Murdoch series, I think, benefited from the kind of treatment you gave them. The bit of stylization, of some great use of music and so on. Is it a case of just keep wanting people to stick with 3 hours of politics? Is it a case of these are larger than life people, so let's heighten everything? And how do you sort of come across? How do you sort of make those choices? And where the music cues and
firstly, I think I suppose it's not about politics, I guess. You know, I suppose one sort of thinks of them as drama, as human drama, really, first and foremost and fundamentally. And it's always the arc of our central character. What is his arc? You know, how can we get in his head? Where does that one begin? You know, if this was a movie, how would it play? So I suppose, and I mean, Kate worked on the Assad series. We didn't have so much to do with the Murdoch series, but I think in a way, although it was a slightly, in a sense, more serious film, it was also approached almost like a sort of family opera. So would you say?
Definitely. I think, you know, similarly with that, it's about what interests me most about this story. I think that's the thing. What interests us most about the story is going to be what's going to grab a viewer and make them want to keep on watching it, like you would a drama. So, you know, with Assad, it was, you know, this sort of strange dissonance of this guy who was a doctor in London, who's suddenly now this dictator and, you know, overseeing these terrible atrocities. How do you get from that to that? And so, of course, that's going to be the opening scene has got to be, here he is in London, and everything follows from there. And I think in the same way with this, the thing that interested us is this guy, you know, the thing you picked up on at the beginning. You know, there's this guy who sort of threw himself into this grand experiment without really having thought about what it would mean. Where's that going to take us? And I think, so I think seeing this as not really seeing them at all as political sort of series that are trying to make sense of history and pin down moments in history, but seeing them as dramatic arcs where, you know, you choose to focus on particular moments because those are turning points, either in, you know, in that person's narrative and that person's character, that tell you something about who they are or how we got here.
But with that narrative, sorry.
The music, I think, is a sort of slightly separate thing of just the tone is so important. You know, obviously, it will define the film in some sense, and so, you know, I listen to a lot of music almost before we do any research, before any scripts, you know, right at the very, very beginning. And there's a lot of listening to music that happens. And, you know, sometimes you'll just find a cue and you'll go, okay, this is good. And you know, you might land on a few things and it just helps you it sort of almost helps you find the territory, and it sort of informs the sort of descriptive element in a sense. So I think it's really good to do that right at the beginning. And
well, you cast your net wide with that music, or do you sort of try and think about stuff that's been released in the time frame you're covering?
Well, it sort of might be informed by different things, you know. So if we think of Trump as a gangster, which is one way of thinking about him, then you might listen to gangster movie music, you know. So you just think about what your underlying series is really about, and then just have a little sort of poodle through, you know. I mean, Spotify, these are wonderful, wonderful tools, right?
Well, I like the way in the clip that we showed, you have a theme tune as you introduce someone, and it's very, you know, that's a very sort of playful way of setting the scene for them, but because you know, these are some larger than life people. But when you think of this this arc that you're talking of, clearly it's an arc that's constantly twisting and turning. I'd imagine it's very hard to kind of feel like you're finishing on a series like this. You know, what point to end on, what kind of, you know, narrative cliffhanger or narrative closure you go for. I gather that this was quite a long way down the line when the president got coronavirus. Can you tell us a bit about where you were at that point and what?
I think we'd locked episode 3, and he got original that day.
What was your original sort of conclusion with episode 3?
Well, we were going to leave it with the national convention in September, where he officially accepted the nomination for running for president. Just to go back a step, I mean, you might say ideally, you know, this series should have aired just after the election, and you'd know the result, and that would have obviously been different, and, you know, in some senses easier for us to do, because there was a point at which we start going out of the realm of documentary into current affairs, because it's so up to the wire, and it's kind of unavoidable, really. But we figured, and the BBC figured, this would have more impact if we went out before the election than after it, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of the frenzy is kind of whipping up, isn't it? It's good to be.
Yeah.
It's up as
But we
far-
had an ending all worked out anyway, and that all got ripped up, and we had sort of 3 days to recut it. So
we're basically we're sort of on tenterhooks to see what would happen to him, and once he was out with the, riding around.
The worry was obviously he would die or be seriously ill in hospital. At which point there would be a question mark about whether they would have wanted to broadcast the film for reasons of taste or whatever. So we're very happy he's safe and well.
Very good. Well, listen, I know we've talked a lot. I mean, there's many questions coming through. I can pick up some of these first of all. One person has asked, did you ever consider including Trump himself amongst the interviewees? Was that something you ever strove for?
It would have been a brilliant problem to have, wouldn't it? I mean, and of course we put in a bid. I mean, a lot of bids. Kate put in a lot of bids, and we wrote his own special bid for him, where we highlighted. It was basically had a huge photo of him on the front, and we highlighted how we were going to have huge ratings. Is that right?
Yeah. Quite big font. Not many words, lots of pictures.
And but no dice. Rudy Giuliani, who was a very interesting guy. I mean, he also promised the day we interviewed him. He said, "Oh, I'm going to see the president later." And we said, "Oh, well, you put in a word for us." And he said he would, but I've not heard back from him.
Were you speaking to him prior to Sacha Baron Cohen, or are you not aware of what the timeline was there?
Well, actually, it had happened. That was why he was quite difficult to get, right?
Yeah, I was wondered.
I mean,
I think he'd excuse me. He started talking to us and then stopped. But Louis charmed his assistant. I think what really happened was just managed to sort of persuade that we were very sensible and not like that. But yeah, it had happened. But we obviously didn't know the context. We just knew that he was cross about
something. Yeah, it was all going through the legal wranglings, I guess. Matt, have you got some others from our audience?
A good question here from Bushra. Just basically saying, I mean, obviously there's so much coverage of Trump. There's so much news coverage. How do you go about, what was it, looking for new footage or slightly different angle on things that people haven't covered? And also just in terms of your selection of what the key, because it is, as you say, a daily, weekly new outrage or incident. How did you pick the key pivotal moments? Were they led by the interviews or vice versa?
Sort of a bit of both, I think. You have to get a sort of a lucky sort of synchronicity between here's some incredible footage where we can actually live in the scene for a while. That will also be a turning point in our film. And it was an interesting difference between the previous Trump series, where you had access to a lot of sort of historic archive that felt less familiar. I think that was probably one of the main challenges of this series, was a lot of that footage we have seen, and it's by definition feels a bit newsier, because as soon as he becomes president, you just don't have that behind the scenes access. So finding kind of B-roll of him just not talking, not at a podium and not at a rally, is very difficult. So that was tricky, but by the same token, a lot of it was just hard work of schlepping and through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage on the part of incredible editors, Sam Bergson, Justin Badger, and Louise Massignan, our assistant editor. And just finding those incredible scenes of drama where he's really, really losing it at the podium, and you've got someone who was in the room and it tells you something about the film. So it's a sort of combination of all those things. But it was obviously, the closer you get to the present day with archive, the harder it gets to give it that sort of ambience, if you like.
Yeah. I mean, also, you mentioned about Bannon, just being on or half your interviews, he's being on the brink of arrest or catching them just before they're being led off to the cells. The question here from Elliot, I think, what was the most surprising part of the shoot? I mean, in terms of the interviews, was anyone who wasn't as you'd expected, or was more so than you expected?
detail. I mean, they're all crazy caricatures of themselves, aren't they?
Yeah, I think in some ways they weren't surprising, because they were exactly as sort of almost bigger and bold and more brazen and sort of themselves than we thought. I think Omarosa was probably the most intense one for me, because she was so in control of the cameras and the setup. She's such a performer, that she, there was just a real sense. She set a timer. She's agreed that she was going to give a certain amount of time. She set a timer, and when her time, without telling us, so when her time went off, she just stood up, walked out. That was it. Her engagement with us she'd agreed to give us an hour and a half. She was absolutely amazing on camera. She'd sort of switch on this charm, but as soon as she was done with the performance, that was it. She was up and she was out. So it was just quite fascinating to see such a professional performance.
So did you think you'd pissed her off, or did you when you watched that, was it clear to you that that's just what it was? It was just her being done.
Business. It's busy. It's a tough sort of show business world, and they roll slightly differently in the US. They're not quite as you don't get the niceties, but they deliver on camera, and then it's okay. And actually we did have in the cut at one point the moment where her alarm went off, and she literally in the middle of an answer stopped, took her alarm out of her handbag, which was sitting by her, turned it off, and said, "Okay, goodbye, guys." Stood up and walked out, and that was it, literally. It's a shame it didn't make the final cut, because it was funny, but it didn't quite work.
Have we got more questions from people? I mean, I think the thing that does strike me, or one of the many things that really struck me about it, was the use of the music, which was so, it really did make it feel cinematic. I mean, I think at one point there was a touch of Apocalypse Now, the helicopters, and sort of sense of Darth Vader coming as Trump was walking and marching up to the podium. And presumably that was very much a conscious decision to use it in that way.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we want it to be, you want it to be entertaining, right? I mean, but also, we had a fantastic composer called Max Zawodner, highly recommended, brilliant in terms of the actual score. And he was very, we talked a lot about what we were sort of trying to say, and who Trump was as a character, and what he meant, and what his whole administration meant. And he came up with some great ideas. And then the use of the commercial tracks was just, it's a sort of cherry on top in a way, which particularly on a show where we wanted to genuinely be balanced and open, and not sort of just be broadcasting agitprop. But at the same time, you can sort of use the music to kind of nudge it here and there if you want to sort of say a little something about it. It's just an extra little tool in your kit bag, as it were, where you could use a lyric or something to sort of give a bit of subtext, if you like. And it's ultimately just to inject a bit of entertainment and a bit of fun, and give the viewer a break from sort of, you've had a little bit of politics, well, sit back and enjoy this.
Yeah. One question that's just come in is, have you heard back from any of the contributors following the series? Any feedback from them?
I don't think it's made its way over yet, because obviously it's not been broadcast here. F3's not been broadcast on TV here yet, so we haven't been able to show it to them. I think the only person we've heard back from is Jeannie, the Reverend in episode 3, who's had a lot of very positive feedback. But no, we're slightly bracing for.
Yeah, bracing for impact.
Yeah.
A couple of questions here is about the sort of practicalities of it. One from Sally about, just to explain a bit more about interviewing people via iPad for those who haven't done it. How, I mean, you alluded to it. How do you keep a kind of connection with them when doing that? Obviously not being in the room. And then a question from Helen, just how do you budget for something that's potentially as open-ended as this? Was it? I don't know whether it was quite.
Well, I just spotted that our production manager is on this Zoom.
Hi, Vanita.
So we're going to be. So you need someone like Vanita Singh Warner on your team. The budget. I mean, that is a headache, because you do need people, on the ground. In this case, in the US, where crew are expensive. So that was an extra cost for sure. In terms of the practicalities, what was the question? How do you?
iPads.
How did you interview? How do you interview somebody remotely?
We did in practical terms. It would be exactly as if it would be exactly as if you were there. So your crew set up. You set up the shot as you wish. They'd be sending either screen grabs back, or they'd be showing you what's on their monitors or the, a WhatsApp call or whatever, so you can help them set up. And then they'd put an iPad on a stand in the eye line where you normally would be doing your interview. So the interviewee is looking at your face on an iPad instead of looking at you. So it's sort of like being there, and you sort of have eye contact, and it's not as good as being there, but I'd say it's almost as good as being there. It particularly for a show like this, which was more, as it were, political. I would imagine if you were doing a different type of show that was based on, we weren't asking people to tell their life stories of trauma, for example, or a different type of film, I imagine, might be harder than the sort of questions we were asking.
Couple more questions, just in terms of the locations for the shoots. Were most of those in people's homes? I mean, the Scaramucci, Bannon, were they at home?
No, we had to follow incredibly strict, very strict protocols to make sure that they were keeping our crew and our contributors safe. So we had to hire places that were large enough that we could maintain social distancing. We had to make sure that they were cleaned, often hiring cleaners ourselves to get them clean to CDC standards, and then make sure no one would go into them, and then make sure that everyone kept at a safe distance. And then the crew would set up, put the camera, and then stay right back. So we only really went to Bannon's place because he was legally had to be there, and then beyond that, we had to find places. So Morosis was actually in her husband's church, which sort of fit. We were able to control and clean. But of course, that as Vanita will know, fit into the added huge budgetary pressures and logistical pressures. So the other person who was absolutely incredible in this series was our junior production manager Emma, who did an incredible job of endlessly finding locations at short notice. When someone had said yes, we'd have to find somewhere that fit this spec. So add an extra layer, a practical layer to the complicated jigsaw.
Right.
Oh, actually, Scaramucci's was in his.
It was his assistant's.
His assistant's garage, and a pool house with the chandeliers.
Yeah.
Amazing. That was a real. I think that's one of the sorts of misses of the things we lost through coronavirus, was not only the experience of being there, but being able to film. We're really lucky with Scaramucci that we had a bit of extra time to be able to shoot a lot more B-roll. And
he turned up in a Rolls Royce, which was like, oh, please, let us film this. And the original plan had actually been to do a lot more of that type of actuality to sort of establish our characters. We were going to go and film Stormy Daniels doing her stand-up routine, in a dive bar in Dallas, etc. So we probably would have ended up with a completely different film, but you sort of just work with what you've got, right? So
yeah, great. Robin, you've got a couple more questions? Anybody or
there's one here. I mean, it's from a recent graduate, so I think it's quite a nice one to ask. Entering the job market, it's finding it tough to get into the industry right now. What would you say are transferable skills or roles that would be most useful for someone who wants to enter producing when they can? From this discussion, it looks like the art of persuasion and savvy emails were key for this series. I don't know, your own personal backgrounds, but thinking about what productions need that you may have gleaned from other work that will help you get a foot in the door. Any thoughts?
Oh, tough one. It's a good emailing. Gosh, all sorts of things.
People skills, interpersonal skills, persuasive skills. I think I think that comment was right, and
and then sort of deep research. I think the other thing that we've been asked this quite a bit. How do we do those interviews remotely? And I think one of the key things is making sure that when we sat down to do the interviews, we sort of knew who we were talking to, knew you had the sort of thorough detailed research, and done a deep backgrounders on people, so that we knew not just details of their stories, but also had a sort of sense of how they might react to questions, or a sense of what was their agenda when they're sitting down to do this interview with us. So I suppose we could research skills.
I don't know. We're not doing very well on this. And it depends on the type of. It does depend on slightly on the type of television or filmmaking that you're interested in going into. So there was an awful lot of reading of very chewy newspaper articles on this series, but that's probably not typical of most TV productions, I suspect. So I think if you like people and you're interested and you've got a bit of initiative and you never give up, I mean, that's the first, that's what you've got to just never be beaten, I think, is really and be prepared to work for nothing for a long time.
I think adaptability as well. I think these sorts, particularly producing. I mean, this series, not literally nothing. No, that's not acceptable. Don't ever accept that.
Yeah.
The adaptability. I think this, huge challenges of this series, like on top of ordinary times, was the sort of endlessly having to kind of come up with new responses. Okay, so we were supposed to be filming a complete, as Rob said, a series that would have a lot more time with the contributors, and it turns into a different series. And then on the sort of more practical side of things, being able to think through the logistics, the locations, the technology of, how are we going to do the core things you need to do, be in a space with somebody, make eye contact with them, make them feel comfortable enough to tell you the things you most want, things they don't know they're going to tell you, and all the stuff that so all the practical things that allow that to happen, from finding the right locations to making sure that you've got enough time to set up, to making sure that the crew you're working with creates the right sort of atmosphere. So yeah, but I think as you say, those are adaptable skills. They are. It's about drive, determination, and good interpersonal skills.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'm conscious of the time, so I think we'll just probably have one more question, unless anyone else pops something up particularly new. But a couple of related questions about how you've put in your bids, because obviously, as you said, all these people must have been getting inundated with things. How did you make them stand out? Did you, a question from Tosca, some of them, Rosemary said, sounds like you'd almost put together really quite slick decks to get through to those people. Did you talk to people who knew the people in order to decide what the best approach was with them? I mean, what was your sort of net casting approach?
It is incredibly bespoke. So, if they've written a book, obviously you read the book and you slip in without making a meal of it. You find the 3 things that you think they'll really love in their book, or you work out what their beef is. You work out what really gets them, or what it is that really angers them about Trump, and you make sure that your film is exactly about that too. So it's research. What else is it?
Yeah, research. It's also reading. I think one thing we learned quite early. Well, the 2 things we learned very early on. One was we spoke to one of his senior advisors, who sort of was quite well exposed to us already, because he was quite a big BBC fan, and he said your picture's really good, but if you want to get Trump, bigger pictures, smaller text. And we sort of took that as a note for all our pictures, and that sort of carried that forward. And then the other thing was that we started by writing quite sort of careful, effusive, wordy pictures, and we realised that by the 3rd no or thanks but no response, that you've got to be direct. Just jump, as I'm you're going to jump straight in with your top line quickly. So it's constantly crafting, and obviously in a bespoke way, depending on who your audience is, but really trying to read them.
Yeah,
you're very explicit in the terms of how you were framing the show, that it was we see this as a reality show. Or are you going as it's more of a measured
BBC documentary.
BBC documentary, exactly.
Well, I think you play the BBC card where it's useful.
Not always, by the sound of it.
No, I mean, where you think that, you know, I don't quite know the answer to that. I mean, we didn't say in terms we're going to turn this into a crazy reality show with wild music. We didn't say that, but we made sure that it was accurate enough that and close enough to, because we didn't ourselves at that point necessarily know what the end point was going to be. But at the same time, obviously, we drafted something that gave us the room for that, so that there couldn't be come back later and people said, well, hang on, I didn't know you were making this kind of show. So it's just treading a careful line, really, between being kind of open about what your aims are, but not trying to put people off.
And also, I think it is important to leave that room, because as much as we knew at the start that there would, the reality TV was a sort of big sort of theme within it, the tone shifted as we were making it, and inevitably was always going to. And so, the episode 3 that we thought we were going to be making in January was completely different and tonally very, very different by the time we got to March and then into May. And so we sort of, you have to kind of have that space, as these films kind of emerge as you're making them. So it's very difficult to be able to pitch a sort of very definitive line. And I think so that's when we're pitching, we have to be able to have the space that allows it to be open-ended.
But the only lesson I've learned from this, from Kate, particularly perseverance. We got a lot of people that said no, 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 and then find, oh yes, and it's sort of just never, ever, ever, ever giving up until the very, very last moment. I think is something I'll take away from this.
I think Louis in particular has the incredibly thick skin to get these incredibly brusque, often quite hurtful no's, and just keep going back. So keep persevering.
Well, perseverance is something we're all going to need a lot of if he wins again. What is your prediction for next Tuesday? Is there another?
I'm all in on the Biden landslide. All in.
I say never trust the poll. I don't trust the polls until the results are in.
Yeah.
He's come back so many times. There've been so many extraordinary comebacks. Just who knows.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you both very much indeed, and for Robin. I think it's a really fun, slightly traumatic series. But if you haven't watched episode 3 yet, do catch up. I think it's 9 o'clock tonight.
9 o'clock tonight, and then there'll always be series 3, the prison years. Yeah, in a Russian gulag. Well, listen, thank you all very much indeed. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Rob. And thank you all. And also, just a reminder, we've got the Grierson masterclasses coming up. So do just follow those on Talent Manager. We'll let you know as soon as they are scheduled. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.